You feel as good as you look, but you look pretty good this morning. I guess if you feel that good, you're going to be dangerous to deal with. So it's great to have you. It's great to see you today. And to those who are watching online, we welcome you as well. Hope that this time together now will be helpful and encouraging to us. Last week, we began a short three-part series on coping with grief and loss. Weeping may tarry for the night, the sweet singer of Israel said, but joy cometh in the morning. This morning we want to take a little closer look at grief. We looked at some fundamentals last week, and I'm going to use what I would call the 5 P's in simplifying or hopefully presenting this in a way that will help each of us to remember it at the appropriate time. A closer look at grief, the 5 P's, if you will, beginning with what might be thought of as the presence of grief. And we'll consider 4 of these in this sermon this morning, and then next week, I want to look at the promise of grief with some practical suggestions. Everybody says, Bob, tell us some ideas. What has worked? What are some practical ideas for me when I am dealing with grief in my life? So for what it's worth, I will try to share some of that next week. But first, the presence of grief. We need to remember a point that we just touched on last week. Grief is unavoidable. Grief is not something that is optional. I'd like to read to you a quotation from Teresa Rando. Quote, all of us are grievers thousands of times over in our lives. This is because grief is a normal reaction to loss, and loss is a natural part of our existence. She explained or defined grief as follows. The process of experiencing the psychological, social, and physical reactions to your perception of loss. So when loss creeps into your life in whatever form, as it will for us all, how do you react to that? How do you perceive that loss? Well, one thing we need to understand is that grief is unavoidable. We need to also appreciate the fact that, as Rando said, grief is work. It requires the expenditure of both physical and emotional energy. It's no less strenuous a task than digging a ditch or another physical labor. It demands much more than merely passively experiencing your reactions to loss. You must actively do things and undertake specific courses of thought and action in order to resolve your grief. Well, if we recognize that grief is going to come, loss is unavoidable in life, we can also understand, I think, that grief is untamable. Untamable in the sense that we never get to the point where it is completely under control. I tried to mention last week that sometimes what makes this so difficult for people is they feel that they're being inappropriate in the expression of their grief. I hope you don't feel that way. Remember that grief is untamable. It's unwieldy. It affects different people in different ways. And so don't feel like it needs to be all braided up in a nice, neat cord, or else there's something wrong with you. And then the other thing is that grief is unpredictable. Grief is going to affect you in ways that you may not have imagined. It is affecting you in ways that you didn't expect. Grief is unpredictable. Even, I might add, if you have experienced grief in the past over some prior loss, and now with something which on the surface seems quite similar, you seem to be reacting differently than you did before. Well, that is to be expected. Grief is not a predictable process. The power of grief. What can grief do? Well, in the first place, it reminds us of something very, very important. Going through a process of grief reminds us each that we are human. Jesus was fully God and yet fully human, a difficult concept certainly to understand. But when in John 11:35 we're told that Jesus wept, it's because, as we are reminded there, Jesus was human. Jesus understood the power of grief. It also resigns us, causes us finally to admit to ourselves that loss can occur. You know, when you're young, you're invincible. You can conquer the world. Why is that? Maybe because young people generally have not experienced loss, at least not to the extent that they shall experience it if they live, if they survive. It resigns us to the fact that we are equal with others. We're not above the fray. But then also notice this. Grief has the power to refine us. God will help us through if we let him. Consider, if you would, this statement from 1 Peter chapter 1, beginning at verse 6. And this is one of those that I would hope you would, if not memorize, at least make a strong mental note that you can refer back to this during times of grief in your own life when they come. Peter said, "Wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, ye have been put to grief in manifold trials." Now, what was happening in their lives? They were being physically persecuted. They were losing loved ones who were being executed. They were experiencing physical pain and torture, and sometimes they were themselves put to death there in the first century. As Christians, they were being put to grief in manifold trials. Now, the word manifold means many. Peter doesn't pause to list all of them. But he shows us with that general, comprehensive word that these verses apply to us if we are experiencing trials in our own life. Well, why is that, Peter? Verse 7, that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold that perisheth, though it is proved by fire, may be found unto praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom not having seen ye love, on whom, though now ye see him not, yet believing, ye rejoice greatly with joy unspeakable and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, even the salvation of your souls. Did you catch the comparison to gold? What happens to gold when it is subjected to heat? And through the refining process, it is heated, sometimes to a liquid stage, so that the impurities can be removed, skimmed off. And when it makes it through the fiery trial, that gold is actually more precious than it was to start with. Peter uses this as a comparison for our trials. As we experience the trials of life, if we allow God to do so, he can use those to refine us. Now, that's an important point to hang on to. Yes, suffering can have a purpose. It can have a good purpose. the end may be better than the beginning, the process of the power of grief. Now, let's look at the process for a moment. The process of grief is, first of all, what I would call cyclical. That is, in a cycle. It is not linear. A person, hopefully, in the grieving process will gradually make progress. One of the shortfalls that some believe exists in the Kübler-Ross analysis, which is a classic work and popular in the field, was for many years, but in many circles has sort of been superseded in this respect. The process of grieving is not a straight line. It is dynamic. It's cyclical and dynamic. The word dynamic means that it's constantly changing. And let's look a little more deeply here at some normal reactions. It often follows a pattern. This may be helpful to us. So if we were to put this into an illustration, to draw a line where on the left you have a person living in what might be called normal functioning of life. We want to get through life in a healthy, normal way, but at some point on that line, there's going to occur what might be called a loss, all right? What happens to the person's life when loss occurs? Well, perhaps it would help to think of it as a cycle or a circle. The first thing you see on that circle spiraling downward is shock. When loss occurs, you may find this model more helpful than the Kübler-Ross idea. Think of a wheel which turns at various speeds, depending on the circumstances. And think of it as possible to fall from one part of the wheel to another and back again. Did you ever ride on the Roundup at the carnival? That was the ride where you stood around, everybody was in a circle around the perimeter, and standing, the whole thing would begin to rotate. You remember that? And it would sort of push you back against the wall. And then what would it do? Well, this whole spinning circle would start to rise up vertically. And there you were spinning around, and at the top of the circle, you were actually still pressed against the ride. Or you remember the ride years ago up at Hershey Park, where you'd be in a chamber like that and be spinning, and the floor would drop. But all the people were pressed against the wall, and they would stay there. Remember that one? Well, maybe that will help to illustrate the process of grief in a cyclical fashion. We're in a circle here. The first thing that happens is usually a period of shock, disbelief, followed often by a period of protest, or what's described on this model as protest. Protest is where we say to ourselves and to others, in essence, this can't happen. This can't be happening. Followed by a period depicted on this model of disorganization. And as a time of confusing, often conflicting emotions and feelings. Now notice that. Confusing, often conflicting emotions and confusion. Well, what do you mean? What's an example? Well, here's one. Anger. Anger. Have you ever felt angry after suffering a loss? I'll have people say to me, Bob, I don't understand why I almost feel angry that this has happened. And I will try to say, it happens. Not at all uncommon to feel angry at a loss. Now, you may say, well, but that's not consistent with who I am as a Christian. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be angry at God, certainly. Anger is a very common part of the disorganization period. Another one is irritability. Did you know that it is difficult to comfort some people who have experienced loss because they appear to be irritable? Maybe you've been there. You've suffered some loss and maybe you're not angry, but it's like, leave me alone. And we're irritable. Very, very common. How about this one? Guilt. Oh, that's a big one. Have you ever felt guilty after a loss as though somehow, some way you could have prevented that loss? Now, I'll have a little more to say about that, Lord willing, in the future. Especially difficult when in reality you could have prevented it. Guilt. Another emotion, often conflicting, is remorse. Remorse is a feeling of wrongdoing, like I have done something wrong here, or this wouldn't be happening. Sometimes we are surrounded by a feeling of just numbness, a general insensitivity to anything. We just don't know what to feel, and we generally don't feel anything at all. And then there is the desire to escape. The desire to escape is often part of this disorganization period. Be careful with this one, folks. And be aware that some people, when they experience loss, are so almost overcome by a desire to escape that they do escape by taking their own life. Very dangerous, potentially dangerous period right after a loss, a period of disorganization, a time of confusing, often conflicting emotions and feelings. But then you notice if we can follow the cycle around, there begins to be a period of reorganization. And notice that the reorganization may be occurring in part, even while the disorganization is still present. Maybe some parts of our life are kind of coming back together while other parts seem to be getting worse. Maybe we go around the circle more than once, maybe many times. And again, maybe we fall from one part of the circle to another in trying to regain healthy functioning in our life. Notice also, folks, that husbands and wives often process grief differently. Where in that cycle are you? Each husband and wife can produce additional challenges by the way they're processing their own grief. If you're married, I don't have to tell you this. You know that experiences that come upon you as a married couple affect you differently. Separate from the initial loss, now we are dealing with the problems of how we are conflicting while trying to process that loss. You see that? Now, the authorities are divided on the statistics for divorce following the loss of a child. If you look that one up, you'll find that the statistics are all over the board. There's one study that suggests 80% of marriages end in divorce following the loss of a child. Another study says, no, that is oversimplified, grossly overstated. It's closer to 16%. Probably the truth is somewhere in between. Why is that? Well, it's because husband processes grief differently than wife. And it enters into not just this loss, the loss of a child, which is certainly among the most severe and difficult losses to face, but any loss, even something that might seem rather trivial to you, may be more difficult for your spouse. It might be helpful if we remember that and the process of grief that we're liable to go through following loss. Now, I want to move to the purpose of grief. I have a quotation there on the bottom of the screen I hope you will remember or be helpful to you. Anderson said, "It's not about getting the person back. It's about getting ourselves back." What is the purpose that we go through this process of grief? All of us do in our own way. Why is that? Well, may I suggest to you that the grieving process can help us to do some things. It can help us to accomplish some things in our life. For example, to accept the reality of loss. I'll have more to say about that in a moment, but for now, just suffice it to say, loss is real, and it does not generally help us to deny that fact, as some have tried to do. Secondly, it helps us to work through, now that's an overused phrase, but we'll come back to that in a moment, to work through the pain of the loss. Thirdly, it can help us to adjust to our new environment. Do you like being suddenly put into a new environment? I doubt it. But that's what loss can do to us. How are we going to adjust to that? And then finally, to find an enduring connection while moving forward. For example, one loses their spouse. They may or they may not get married again. One loses a child. They may or may not have another child. In their efforts to move forward, can they find an enduring connection with their past? All right, let's talk now in closing about working through loss. We'll have, Lord willing, a little more specific things to say about this next week and some scriptures that will help us. Because to me, that's the most practical part of this whole series. How do we actually do this? But this morning, let me share with you 6 points that may be helpful if you find yourself working through loss. Number one, we need to acknowledge the reality of death. Now, I mentioned this a moment ago. Although initial denial is often very normal, a prolonged refusal to acknowledge reality can be harmful. Death is part of the human experience. Loss, we've already seen, comes to all of us. We need to acknowledge that, as difficult and painful as that may be, that is a fact of life, a reality. But now coupled closely with that, number two, is the need to approach the pain of loss while being supported. The only thing harder than experiencing pain is experiencing it without support. Have you ever gone to the dentist to have a cavity drilled? And you were receiving the support of what's called Novocaine? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I bet you there are some in here who don't get Novocaine. because you want the pain to be temporary and then done. And when you walk out of that office, you don't want to deal with the effects of Novocaine. But Novocaine is a support. Well, in loss, when we lose a loved one or when we suffer a setback on our job or in our work or in our career or in our personal life, we may need and thankfully receive various forms of support. I have watched in memorial services following the death of a loved one how brothers and sisters in Christ will render support one to another. It's a beautiful thing. Paul said to the Galatians, "Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ." It's like trying to carry a heavy board or some heavy object by oneself instead of saying, "Hey, can you help me with this?" We need to approach the pain of loss while being supported, and sometimes support is curtailed too early. We back away, and that person is still struggling to carry that heavy object. They haven't gotten yet to where they're going with it. I mentioned that in our culture, the United States, and in many Western cultures, there is a tendency to rush the support process. To act as though, once the funeral is completed, our job of supporting one another is done. That's not reality. In fact, oftentimes the real heavy lifting comes after the funeral, doesn't it? And so if you are receiving the support of your brethren, be thankful for that. The encouragement, the cards, the calls, just the pats on the back when someone doesn't even know what to say. That's the time to work through the pain of loss. We need to remember, thirdly, to the person who died. And moving on with life does not mean forgetting about the loved one. This is another common misconception. Oh, you need to forget about that and go on. No. You need to find a way to remember the person who died. What works for you may not work for another. It may be a picture, a photograph. It may be a place at the table. It may be clothing in the closet. It may be music. It may be traditions or rituals. It may be songs that you sing to yourself. But somehow or another, that memory needs to be cherished and preserved and protected in a wholesome way. Along with that comes the development of a new self-identity. Now, to some, this comes rather easily. Others struggle with this. How am I going to act now that my spouse is no longer with me? Where am I going to sit in the auditorium? Where am I going to go after the services? To some, these questions are easily answered, and it just seems natural and works out fine. Others really struggle with that. The process of developing a new method of living in this new situation. Number 5, I must find meaning in what has happened. You remember when David went to God in prayer when his child was sick, nigh unto death. And then finally the servants came and told him that the child had died. They were concerned about David because he had been in deep, deep mourning, very emotionally down. The text says, "Then said his servants unto him, what thing is this that thou hast done? Thou didst fast and weep for the child while it was alive, but when the child was dead, thou didst rise and eat bread. You see, they didn't understand his reaction. Verse 22 of 2 Samuel 12 says, "And he said, While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, Who knoweth whether Jehovah will not be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead. Wherefore should I fast?" Now watch this. Can I bring the child back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. David was at once being realistic, acknowledging the reality of death. He was approaching the pain of the loss while receiving the support of those around him. He was remembering the person. He was developing his new self-identity without that child in his life. But most of all, he was finding meaning in what had happened. I understand what has occurred. And finally here, number 6, I must experience continued support in future years. Watch for new friends, new relationships, new enriching experiences which may come into your life during a time of grieving, often unexpected. None of this is easy. That's why it's called work. That's really why we started this sermon with that quotation about effort. Working through the loss, but hopefully there are suggestions there that would be helpful to us all. Folks, I want to close by saying something personal to you. These sermons, the one last week and the one now and then next week, these are not easy sermons to preach. I think you understand that. And I don't have the answers that I wish I had. I hope that these principles from God's Word will be helpful to you. They may be helpful in just a little tiny way. But then again, in the future, you may remember something that was said here that'll be helpful to you in a big way. The main thing I want to get across in each of these sermons is what's called the invitation to follow Jesus Christ. Loss can be borne, can be worked through, if you will, with the help of Jesus Christ and with your brothers and sisters in Christ. So if you're not a child of God this morning, if you are here thinking, I see loss in my life, I feel it, I see it coming, or I have felt it in the past, may I urge you to cast your burdens on Jesus Christ. He is the true shepherd of your soul. He's the one that can help you through this or any loss. If you're not a Christian this morning, how desperate is that need? Would you respond in obedience to him? While together we stand.